You have in mind a very good book. I think she was teaching here in Oxford, April Carter on authority, where she was explaining all these concepts of authority, hierarchy, and so on. And she was saying something important, that you have what you may call natural hierarchies, in the sense that if, say, you get into an airplane to fly from here to Athens, then obviously you are under the hierarchical power of the pilot, or if you go to a ship, you are under the hierarchical power of the captain. Why? Because he has the knowledge and the training and so on to fly the plane or whatever. Now, this is a form of hierarchy, but this is very different from the kind of hierarchy we are talking about now. Now, here, we're talking about hierarchy where people can exercise power just because they are on top of you. If you are in the army, say, the captain gives you orders and you have to implement them without asking why and so on, just because he's the captain. We're not talking about this kind of hierarchy. We're talking about only a hierarchy of authority, which is natural in the sense that in every kind of society, say, people who had more experience in the past, in tribes, it was the older people who had more experience, so on. That's why they even had assemblies of the older people. Okay, that's a kind of hierarchy that could be explained and to some extent could be legitimized because it is justified on the basis of certain principles of experience or principles of knowledge, extra knowledge, and so on. But we're not talking about this. We're talking about hierarchy that arises out of the fact that people have power over other people just because they have either the control of the means of production or because they are professional politicians who take all effective decisions or whatever. So I don't think that we cannot imagine societies where without this kind of elites, political and economic elites, cannot function. I don't think this is the problem.
Yeah, so the point is there is hierarchy, right? There will be hierarchy under an inclusive democracy. It's just that the hierarchy is going to be legitimated by democratic procedures and good reasons, right?
No, if you mean that we appoint, say, in classical Athens as well, they were appointing generals.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, in this sense, there was some kind of hierarchy, but why? Because the assembly was taking for granted that certain people had some extra knowledge in order to carry out a war or whatever. Now, this is a different thing. Yeah, okay, then voluntarily assemblies were deciding that these kind of people have knowledge that we do not have each one of us individually, and therefore they have to take decisions. In this sense, yeah.
Excellent. I agree with that. Aren't you afraid that this may create, with the passage of time, a sort of centralization of authority at the higher echelons? Precisely because they're smarter, better, and more knowledgeable people.
No, because that depends on what democratic safety valves exist. That is, if you have a society where people elect this kind of, for example, in the classical Athens, generals, etc., were elected for a specific period of time, and then only if the assemblies wanted to renew it, they were appointing them again. So the same could happen in an inclusive democracy. That is, if people decide that for a period of time and for this kind of knowledge, etc., we can give some extra power to some sort of people to do a particular kind of task, then this is not the institutional framework that will create permanent hierarchies. These are hierarchies which are imposed by natural reasons, if you like to call them like this, and for usually temporary periods. So I think it depends on the level of consciousness, the democratic consciousness of people. If people are fully conscious of their own autonomy, that's the basis of a democracy, what we may call individual and collective autonomy. If people are fully conscious that they cannot be autonomous if they have other people deciding for them, then I don't think that this kind of permanent hierarchy will develop. It may develop, but if they did, then democracy would have failed.
Nikki.
Yeah, since you're talking about classical Athens, and I think that the political system you're suggesting is just marvelous, just like the direct democracy we have in mind about classical Athens, but just imagine that it has an element of utopia which I think you cannot avoid. And I will go again back to classical Athens. There are a lot of secret dialogues and dirty dialogues before the speeches we have from generals, and they are the evidence of direct democracy. Themistocles or Pericles wasn't such fair people. How do you think that you can avoid the combination of patriotism and self-interest? How do you think that a good educational system can just transform human personality into something so much fair, in order to have people who are only interested about the common good and not about their personal power and how,
Yeah, I do not assume, I do not make any assumptions about human nature, because that's a problem. Usually libertarian thinkers today, people like Chomsky, argue that human nature is by nature is a good kind of personality, and it's only the system that distorts it and so on. I don't agree with this. I don't think that human nature is either good or bad, that somebody is born good or bad. I think that it is kind of tabula rasa, that people are born neither bad or good, that it is then a matter of the environment they are grown up, where they develop the personality. So, on your question whether this could be characterized as a utopia, I think that a utopia is something that if, say, an intellectual sits in his desk or her desk and imagines a good system, then it is a utopia. For example, Michael Albert, his Paracon, confesses himself that this is my vision about how we can secure certain good values and create a good society. Mm-hmm. However, the inclusive democracy project is not at all like this, because, as I said at the beginning, the ideas behind the inclusive democracy project first express the present reality in the sense of it expresses the conditions of crisis we live on and how we can move out of the crisis. And therefore an inclusive democracy suggested not just as an ideal but also as a way out of the deepening multidimensional crisis that we live through. Second, not only this, but it also expresses the discontent of people at various levels, because, as I said, the reason why crime has developed in the way it has developed now, the reason why consumerism has developed, the reason why we destroy nature and so on, all these can be explained in terms of certain institutional factors and the corresponding values, because the institutions create their own values, what we may call the dominant paradigm, the dominant social paradigm. But it's not only this, it's also that there are historical trends we're talking about. That is, in every insurrection, especially in the post-war period, you will notice that people started implementing various kinds of democracy like the ones I described. Not only in May '68, which this was obvious, but even more recently, people in Argentina in 2000, they developed various kinds of inclusive democracy. In fact, in this book on globalized capitalism that was published in May, there is an article by an Argentinian who describes how the assemblies that developed in Buenos Aires and elsewhere had very much the characteristics of the assemblies we describe in inclusive democracy. That is, how you could explain that people in every insurrectionary situation in the post-war period, not only in Argentina, not only in May '68, but also in the Hungarian councils in '56, people developed various forms of direct democracy, of taking political decisions, and also in Argentina of taking economic decisions, creating various kinds of co-ops and taking over the private factories that became bankrupt and so on. You can't explain them unless there is a kind of tradition, I think, this democratic tradition, I call it, that is suppressed by the present institutions, in fact, you can explain the entire history in terms of a conflict between what we may call the autonomy tradition and the heteronomy tradition. That is dominant in history, of course, was the heteronomy tradition. But this was not because it was a more efficient one, as Hage could say. It was because usually the elites that were controlling the means of production, etc., were using either economic violence or even political and military violence, and were imposing their own will. So, the proof of this is that whenever there was any serious interaction, from the French Revolution to the Soviet Revolution and the post-war insurrections I mentioned, always the question of autonomy, the question of people taking their own decisions did arise. So you can't explain this unless you assume that there is an autonomy tradition which had been suppressed. And it is this kind of tradition that we try to express through this project.
Okay, I think we should wrap it up.
Okay.
Thanks very much for coming,
Thank
and
you.
thank you. You can help yourselves with the books in the back, have a look.
Yes, you like to have a look.
So,